Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 22, The Bald Eagle, The American Novel, Whiskey Rebellion, and Latinos. American Bald Eagle, U.S. National Emblem. The bald eagle was chosen on June 20th, 1782, as the emblem of the United States of America because of its long life, great strength, and majestic looks, and because it was believed to exist only on this continent. We see an eagle with outspread wings on its back on our gold coins, the silver dollar, the half dollar, and the quarter. The eagle was used as a national emblem because, at one of the first battles of the Revolution, which occurred early in the morning, the noise of the struggle awoke the sleeping eagles on the heights. They flew from their nests and circled about over the heads of the fighting men, all the while giving vent to their boisterous cries. "They are shrieking for freedom," said the patriots. The eagle became the national emblem in 1782 when the government adopted the Great Seal of the United States. The Great Seal shows a widespread eagle, face front, having on its breast a shield with 13 perpendicular red and white stripes, surmounted by a blue field with the same number of stars. In his right talon, the eagle holds an olive branch. In his left, a bundle of 13 arrows. In his beak, he carries a scroll inscribed with the motto, E pluribus unum. The eagle appears in the seal of many of our states, and most of our gold and silver coinage, and is used a great deal for decorative patriotic purposes. On the Second Continental Congress, after the 13 colonies voted to declare independence from Great Britain, the colonies determined that they needed an official seal. So, Dr. Franklin, Mr. Adams, and Mr. Jefferson, as a committee, prepared a device for a seal of the United States of America. However, the only portion of the design accepted by Congress was the statement E pluribus unum, attributed to Thomas Jefferson. 6 years and 2 committees later, in May of 1782, the brother of a Philadelphia naturalist provided a drawing showing an eagle displayed as the symbol of supreme power and authority. Congress liked the picture, so before the end of 1782, an eagle holding a bundle of arrows in one talon and an olive branch in the other was accepted as a seal. Artists completed the image with a shield of red and white stripes covered the breast of the bird, a crest above the eagle's head with a cluster of 13 stars surrounding by bright rays going out to a ring of clouds, and a banner held by the eagle in its bill bearing the words E pluribus unum. Yet it was not until 1787 that the American bald eagle was officially adopted as the emblem of the United States. This happened only after many states had already used the eagle in their coat of arms, as New York State did in 1778. Though the official seal has undergone some modifications in the last 200 years, the basic design is the same. Benjamin Franklin wrote, "I wish the bald eagle had not been chosen as a representative of our country. He's a bird of bad moral character. He does not get his living honestly. You may have seen him perched on some dead tree where, too lazy to fish for himself, he watches the labor of the fishing hawk. And when that diligent bird has at length taken a fish and is bearing it to its nest for the support of his mates and young ones, the bald eagle pursues him and takes it from him. Besides, he is a rank coward. The little king bird, not bigger than a sparrow, attacks him boldly and drives him off of the district. He is therefore by no means a proper emblem for the brave and honest of America. For a truth, the turkey is in comparison a much more respectable bird, and withal a true original native of America, a bird of courage. It would not hesitate to attack a grenadier of the British Guards, who should presume to invade his farmyard with a red coat on." Franklin was clearly against the eagle, and everyone knows it. Alcohol in the late 18th century. Americans drank an average of 34 gallons of beer and cider, 5 gallons of distilled spirits, and 1 gallon of wine per year in 1790. In the decades immediately following the American Revolution, Americans drank more alcohol per capita than ever before, or since. Alcohol was, first and foremost, a practical choice. In the days before understanding bacteria and purification, colonists believed water was unhealthy since it made them sick. Alcohol was a safer choice, and by the 18th century, distilled spirits were cheap and widely available. Alcohol was such a normal part of society that it was served at almost every meal and social occasion, even at work. Colonists believed in drinking different alcoholic beverages as part of a proper diet. Taverns were hubs for social activity where colonists could also read newspapers, hold business meetings, or lodge for the night. You could even pick up your mail at taverns. Taverns were essentially the first American post office. This prominent drinking culture created a society where heavy drinking was expected, but drunkenness was loathed. In the Drinker's Dictionary, published in the Pennsylvania Gazette, believed it had been written by Ben Franklin, recorded dozens of terms used to refer to drunkenness, such as fuddled, moon-eyed, like a rat in trouble, and in the suds. Visitors to America often noticed how much colonists drank and were impressed that they could imbibe heavily without the appearance of intoxication. Even though substantial alcohol consumption was socially acceptable, alcohol abuse was viewed as a moral failing, and offenders faced punishment and public humiliation. One Massachusetts tavern went as far as posting a list of men who had been accused of public drunkenness on their front door. Benjamin Rush, a pioneer of psychiatry and a signer of the Declaration of Independence, was one of the first and earliest Americans to recognize alcoholism as a disease. In his 1784 essay, An Inquiry into the Effects of Spirituous Liquors, Rush asserted that spirituous liquors destroy more lives than the sword. Alcohol would not be widely judged as a social evil until the Great Second Awakening spurred temperance movement in the 19th century. In the 18th century, Caribbean islands like Barbados were fellow members of the British Empire and close trading partners with the American colonies. Rum was a critical part of the triangle trade between the Americas, Europe, and Africa. This included the slave trade, in which over 12 million Africans were forcibly displaced across the Atlantic Ocean. Millions of enslaved Africans were sent to work on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, where molasses was produced as a byproduct of processing sugarcane. Some of these molasses were sent to New England to be used in distilling rum. This link to the British Caribbean meant rum could be made and sold cheaply in the American colonies or purchased directly from the Caribbean for a higher price. According to Colonial Williamsburg, some historians estimate that Americans drank an average of 3 pints of rum every week before the Revolution. In 1770, there were over 140 rum distilleries in the colonies, cranking out 4.8 million gallons of rum every year. Local and home brewing were routine to many American colonists. Hard cider was one of the most common. Small farmers could not afford to purchase alcohol, made their unhopped ale and ciders from apple, peaches, and other local produce. While some home brewing was standard, practices and preferences varied widely across regions and classes. While alcohol production was seen as a male activity in New England and the middle colonies, women were the leading producers of alcohol at home in the Chesapeake. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were among these enterprising Americans. Following his presidency, Washington's Scottish farmer manager John Anderson convinced him to start a whiskey business. Anderson rightly assured Washington that it would be an extremely profitable investment. By his death in 1799, Washington would have the largest distillery in Virginia. Operating with 5 stills instead of 2 or the typical or 3, Washington's distilleries produced 10,500 gallons of whiskey and brandy in a single year, valued at more than $7,500. About 100 miles southwest of Mount Vernon, Washington's fellow Virginian Jefferson also plotted his venture in alcohol with much less success. A dedicated Francophile, Jefferson dreamed of recreating the European wine he loved on Virginia soil. In 1773, Jefferson converted 2,000 acres of land into a vineyard, but time after time, the grapes failed. Jefferson wasn't alone. Other prominent planters tried to grow wine grapes with similar results. His French friends ridiculed Washington's vineyard. Quote, "I wish I could walk and go towards the grove to observe the growth of your trees, even in our vineyards, that a Frenchman can, I dare say, examine without jealousy. For, my dear General, you can sow and reap laurels, but grapes and wine are not within the compass of your powers." End quote. In 1784, Dr. Benjamin Rush published his pamphlet, An Inquiry into the Effects of Spirituous Liquor upon the Human Body and Their Influence upon the Happiness of Society. He promoted his idea that alcoholism is an odious disease for which he recommended cures included whipping the patient severely, blistering the ankles, bleeding, purging with toxic substance. Parenthetically, he also promoted his belief that being black was a result of a curable skin disease, which he called negroidism. Intermarrying, he argued, helped spread the disease. In 1785, when Reverend Philip Otterburn organized his first United Brethren in Christ Church in the U.S., he took perhaps the strongest stand that had ever been taken officially by any minister up to that time by excluding from partaking in communion all those who indulge in strong drink. In 1786, Thomas Sowell was a temperance activist who created an 8-graphic colored drawing of which he called alcohol disease stomachs. These were widely distributed to promote abstinence. One temperance leader sent a copy to every household in New York and sent 150,000 copies to poorhouses, prisons, hospitals, and schools. In 1789, the first Kentucky whiskey was distilled by Reverend Elijah Craig, a Baptist minister. Religious events were occasions for drinking. Consumed at the ordination of a minister in Woburn, Massachusetts, were 6½ gallons of hard cider, 25 gallons of wine, 2 gallons of brandy, and 4 gallons of rum. The fourth president of the U.S., James Madison, proposed a low tax on beer to encourage the manufacture of beer in every state in the Union. Massachusetts passed a law to promote the production of a strong beer, ale, and other malt liquors. Wholesome qualities of malt liquors greatly recommend them to general use as an important means of preserving the health of the citizens and the Commonwealth. Upwards of 200 of the most respectable farmers in the county of Litchfield, Connecticut, have formed themselves into an association to discourage the use of spirituous liquors and have determined not to use any distilled liquors in doing their farming work the ensuing season. Folk hero Johnny Appleseed, or John Chapman, began wandering in the northeastern U.S. planting seeds for apples. Being sour, the apples were not intended for eating, but for the production of hard cider. In the 1790s, happy hour typically began at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and cocktails were enjoyed until dinner. The first American novel. In the late 18th and early 19th century, the first American novels were published. These fictions were too lengthy to be printed as a manuscript or public reading. Publishers took a chance on these works in hopes that they would become a steady seller and need to be reprinted. This scheme was ultimately successful because male and female literacy rates were increasing at the time. January 21st, 1789, the novel The Power of Sympathy by William Hill Brown was published in Boston. The book is widely accepted as the first American novel to be written and published. Before this, likely, American publishers were publishing European manuscripts. The Power of Sympathy was written as a series of letters between the various characters and set out to warn the readers of the folly of following one's sexual passions to their conclusion. In 1789, the cost of a newly printed copy of The Power of Sympathy was 9 shillings. At this point, the Congress of the United States had not gotten around to passing legislation regarding the use of coins and decimal currency within the country. That would not happen until 1792 with the passage of the Mint Act. The young nation was still using British coins as a staple of their currency at the time. 9 shillings equates to roughly 60 cents in 2021. Today, the book runs around 90 or so pages. Those 90 pages tell a haughty and dry tale of 2 lovers, Thomas and Harriet, who go against tradition and instinct to form a bond to the great dismay of the patriarchs of the novel. The author wants to convey that branching out sexually, following your passions, and using the old seduction methods are very tools of self-destruction itself. Throughout the novel, it's revealed that Jack and Harriet are related. This means they're actually in an incestuous relationship, a truly devastating revelation. This would be traumatic under the best circumstances, but William Hill Brown wants to nail his premise home even further. After discovering the true nature of their affair, Harriet develops consumption and dies. Soon after Harriet's death, Jack succumbs to depression and kills himself. Besides being the first American novel ever published, the book never saw widespread popularity. It sold poorly and was received poorly. Today, it mainly serves as a historical touchstone that you can interact with to know the state of things when the first American novel was published. The first genuinely groundbreaking American novel was not published until 1826 with The Last of the Mohicans, a narrative of 1757. That novel will become one of the greatest selling English-language novels of all time. The Kentucky Volunteer. The Kentucky Volunteer is a song published in the United States on January 6, 1794. Its music was composed by Raynor Taylor and its lyrics by A Lady of Philadelphia. It is noteworthy for being the first musical composition copyrighted under the new United States Constitution. It was also the first work published by Benjamin Carr, an English musician. He had just immigrated to Philadelphia from England to become the country's most prolific music printer in that decade. The actual identity of the lyricist remains a mystery. Benjamin Carr published the song as part of a series of pieces published every Monday. Sheet music was available for 1/4 of a dollar each. It was composed by a fellow English immigrant and friend of Carr, Raynor Taylor, who had arrived in the U.S. 2 years before Carr. The series may not have been wildly successful, as it only lasted 5 weeks. The other 4 songs in the series were not copyrighted. 3 of them had been popular songs from London musicals, and the 4th a piano exercise by Alexander Renagle, another English immigrant and friend of Carr's. The U.S. Constitution had a section authorizing the federal government to grant a monopoly to authors and inventors for a limited time. The Copyright Act of 1790 covered only maps, charts, and books for 14 years, renewable 1 time. This meant that actual music was not intended to be protected, but printed sheet music counted as a book, and in early 1794, Carr acted on his fact and got his print of the Kentucky Volunteer copyrighted. Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion was a 1794 uprising of farmers and distillers in western Pennsylvania to protest a whiskey tax enacted by the federal government. Following years of aggression with tax collectors, the region finally exploded in a confrontation that resulted in President Washington sending troops to quell what some feared could be a full-blown revolution. Opposition to the whiskey tax and the rebellion built support from the Republicans, overtaking Washington's Federalist Party power in 1802. The Whiskey Rebellion is considered one of the first major tests in the authority of a newly formed U.S. government. During the American Revolution, individual states incurred significant debt. In 1790, Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton pushed for the federal government to take over the debt. He also suggested an excise tax on whiskey to prevent further financial difficulty. President George Washington was opposed to Hamilton's suggestion of a whiskey tax. In 1791, Washington journeyed through Virginia and Pennsylvania to speak to citizens about their views. Local government officials met the idea of a whiskey tax with enthusiasm, and Washington took this assurance back to Congress, which passed the bill. But protests against the new tax began immediately, arguing that the tax was unfair to small producers. Under the new law, large producers paid the tax annually at a rate of 6 cents per gallon, and the more they produced, the further the tax breaks. Small producers, however, were stuck with paying 9 cents per gallon in taxes. Farmers took further issue because collectors would accept only cash for tax payment. The law was immediately a failure since refusals to pay the taxes were as common as intimidation against officials hired to collect them. Farmers met excise officers sent to collect the tax with defiance and threats of violence. Some producers refused to pay the tax. Perhaps inevitably, violence broke out. On September 11, 1791, excise officer Robert Johnson was riding through his collection route in western Pennsylvania when he was surrounded by 11 men dressed as women. The mob stripped him naked and then tarred and feathered him before stealing his horse and abandoning him in the forest. Johnson recognized 2 men in the mob. He made a complaint and warrants were issued for their arrest. A cattle drover named John Connor was sent with the warrants, and he suffered the same fate as Johnson. He was tied to a tree in the woods for 5 hours before being found. In response, Johnson resigned his post, fearing further violence. Incidents escalated over the next few years. In 1793, the home of Pennsylvania excise officer Benjamin Wells was broken into twice. The first time, a mob of people forced their way into and assaulted Wells' wife and children. The second incident involved 6 men in disguises who attacked Wells while he was at home. The intruders demanded Wells' account books at gunpoint and insisted he resigns his position. Feeling unrepresented in Congress, the citizens of Western Philadelphia gathered their assembly with 3 to 5 representatives per county. While radical members pushed for open rebellion, moderates like Hugh Henry Breckinridge and future Secretary of the U.S. Treasury Albert Gallatin urged conciliatory measures. In 1794, Federal Marshal David Lennox began the process of serving writs to 60 distillers in western Pennsylvania who had not paid the tax. On July 14, Lennox accepted tax collector and wealthy landowner John Neville as a guide through the Allegheny County. On July 15, they approached the home of William Miller, who refused to accept his summons. An argument ensued, and when Lennox and Neville rode off, they were face to face with an angry mob armed with pitchforks and muskets, many of these protesters believed to be drunk. Someone had told the mob that federal agents were dragging people away, but Lennox and Neville were allowed to pass once they understood this to be untrue. Nonetheless, a shot was fired at the 2 men as they rode away. On the morning of July 16, Neville was asleep in his home, Bower Hill, when he was awakened by a crowd of angry men, some of whom had been served summons the previous day. The men claimed that Lennox needed to come with them because he was a threat to his life. Neville didn't believe the men and ordered them off his property. When the mob refused to move, Neville grabbed his gun and shot at the crowd, striking and killing Oliver Miller. In retaliation, the mob shot back at his house. Neville made it inside the house and sounded a signal horn, after which he heard the sound of his slaves attacking the crowd with firearms. 6 members of the mob were wounded before they fled with Miller's body. By evening, the band had reconvened for a meeting with a group of other people who declared revenge on Neville. On July 7, 1794, as many as 700 men marched to drums and gathered at Neville's home. They demanded his surrender, but Major James Kirkpatrick, one of the 10 soldiers who had come to the property to help defend it, answered that Neville was not there. Kirkpatrick had helped Neville escape the house and hide in a ravine. The mob demanded that the soldiers surrender. When the mass refused that request, they set fire to a barn and slave dwellings. The Neville women were allowed to flee to safety, after which the mob opened fire on the house. Following an hour of gunfighting, the mob leaders, James McFarland, was killed. The crowd set fire to other buildings in a rage, and the soldiers soon surrendered as the Bower Hill estate burned to the ground. Less than a week later, the mob met with local dignitaries who warned that Washington would send a militia to strike them down, and they had to strike first. Wealthy landowner David Bradford, along with several other men, attacked a mail carrier and discovered 3 letters from Pittsburgh expressing disapproval of the attacks on Neville's property. Bradford used these letters as an excuse to encourage an attack on Pittsburgh, citing 7,000 men to show up at Braddock's Field east of the city. The city of Pittsburgh, fearing violence, sent a delegation to announce that the 3 letter writers had been expelled from the city and to offer a gift of several barrels of whiskey. As the day ended, a crowd had drunk deeply from the barrels and weren't inspired to descend on Pittsburgh with any fury, instead of gaining permission to march through Pittsburgh peacefully. With signs that the rebels were hoping to reignite the conflict and believing that it was linked to unrest in other parts of the country, Hamilton wanted to send troops to Pennsylvania. Still, Washington opted for a peace envoy instead. The peace envoy failed. Washington met with his cabinet officials and presented evidence of the violence to Supreme Court Justice James Wilson. Wilson justified a military response under the auspices of the Militia Acts of 1792. Washington assumed emergency power to assemble more than 12,000 men from the surrounding states and eastern Pennsylvania as a federal militia. Washington met first with the rebels, who assured him Washington did not need the militia and that order had been restored. Washington opted to retain the military option until proof of submission was apparent. The large and well-armed militia marched into western Pennsylvania and was met with angry citizens but little violence. When an rebel army didn't appear, the militia rounded up suspected rebels instead. However, the rebels' instigators had already fled, and the militia's prisoners weren't involved in the uprising. They were marched to Philadelphia to stand trial regardless. Only 2 men were found guilty of treason, and Washington pardoned both. Historians widely believe the federal response to the Whiskey Rebellion to be a critical test of national authority, one that Washington's fledgling government met with success. The whiskey tax was inspired, the rebellion remained in effect until 1802. Under the leadership of President Thomas Jefferson and the Republican Party, which, like many citizens, opposed Hamilton's Federalist tax policies, the government repealed the tax after continuing to be utmost impossible to collect. Latinos in the 18th century. According to the United States Census of 1790, which was the first census of the United States, there were 20,000 people of Hispanic and Latino origin living in the former British colonies in that year. However, the Census Bureau estimated the origins of the population based on their surnames. In 1776, when the American Revolution was beginning in the East, another part of the future United States was born in California. Junipero Serra entered the Franciscan order. Until he was 35, he spent most of his time in the classroom, first as a theology student and then as a professor. He also became famous for his preaching. Suddenly, he gave it all up and followed the yearning that had begun years before when he had heard of the missionary work of St. Francis Solano in South America. Junipero desired to convert native peoples to the New World. Arriving by ship at Veracruz, Mexico, he and a companion walked 250 miles to Mexico City. On the way, Junipero's left leg became infected by an insect bite and would remain a cross, sometimes life-threatening, for the rest of his life. For 18 years, he worked in central Mexico and the Baja Peninsula. He became president of the missions there. Enter politics. The threat of a Russian invasion south of Alaska. Charles III of Spain ordered an expedition to beat Russia to the territory. So the last two conquistadors, one military, one spiritual, began their quest. Jose de Galvez persuaded Junipero to set out with him for present-day Monterey, California. The first mission founded after the 900-mile journey north was San Diego in 1769. That year, a shortage of food almost canceled the expedition. Vowing to stay with the local people, Junipero and another friar began a novena in preparation for St. Joseph's Day, March 19, the scheduled day of departure. On that day, the relief ship arrived. Other missions followed. Junipero made the long trip to Mexico City to settle significant differences with the military commander. He arrived at the point of death. The outcome was substantially what Junipero thought, the famous regulation protecting the Indians and the mission. It was the basis of the first significant legislation in California, a Bill of Rights for Native Americans. Because the Native Americans lived a non-human life from the Spanish point of view, the friars were made their legal guardians. The Native Americans were kept at the mission after baptism, lest they be corrupted into their former haunts, a move that has brought cries of injustice from some modern people. From this perspective, Serra's singular purpose was to save the souls of indigenous Americans. He believed that the death of an unconverted heathen was tragic, while the death of a baptized convert was a cause for joy. He maintained a patriarchal or fatherly attitude towards the Native American population. He wrote that spiritual fathers should punish their sons, the Indians, with blows appeared to be as old as the conquest of the Americas, so general in fact that the saints do not seem to be an exception to this rule. Punishment was made clear to the natives that we, every one of us, came here for the single purpose of doing them good and their eternal salvation. Serra also led efforts to protect the natives from abuse under Spanish soldiers. After a series of abuses on the native population at the hands of local soldiers, Serra and other missionaries protested against the governor of Alta California, Pedro Vargas, who refused to reprimand his soldiers. Serra then departed for Mexico on October 17, 1772, to plead his case to the viceroy. He requested Serra sent his grievances in writing. This document, which consisted of 32 points, also laid out the rights of Native Americans in Spanish California and protections against the soldiers, placing them under the governance of the missions. Mission Indians enjoyed rights as human beings under the protection of the Spanish monarchy. They were recognized as children of God. This stood in contrast of the treatment of natives on the east coast of America, who were guaranteed no rights. Native Americans objected to the Catholic Church's canonization of Serra, charging the priests directed and approved the torture and enslavement of natives at missions that served as both religious and military installations. On July 4, 2020, during the worldwide civil unrest that occurred after the murder of George Floyd, a group of people toppled the statue of Serra located near the California State Capitol in Sacramento. The group was among an estimated 200 protesters who marched through the streets of Sacramento. You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm RyanGLancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.